Have you ever wondered if a single ride could change your entire life? What if a stranger, someone you'd never expect, held a piece of your past so precious, so painful, that it could shatter everything you thought you knew? What if a simple Uber request could unearth a story of survival buried deep in the ashes of war? In the heart of Chicago, under a grey November sky that seemed to weigh heavier with every passing day, Emily Harper stood on the cracked sidewalk of her quiet street in Lincoln. Park! The wind bit at her cheeks, carrying the sharp, familiar scent of Lake Michigan just a few blocks away, a reminder of the city's unrelenting pulse, even on its coldest days. Emily, 32, wrapped her worn wool scarf tighter around her neck, her hazel eyes distant, as if searching for something beyond the row of brick townhouses and leafless trees. Her hands, calloused from years of labor at a local diner and nights spent sketching in a tiny apartment, fiddled with her phone as she booked an Uber to get to a job interview downtown. But behind that mundane act, there was a quiet storm. Her shoulders slumped under an invisible burden, her breaths shallow, as if she carried a weight no one could see. It wasn't just the exhaustion of working double shifts or the anxiety of the interview, it was something deeper, something etched into her very bones, a shadow of loss, of stories she never spoke of, stories of a family fractured by a war she barely remembered but could never forget. Emily's life was a patchwork of survival, stitched together with grit and stubborn Midwestern resilience. Born to immigrant parents who fled the Kosovo War in the late 90s, she grew up on hushed tales of escape, whispers of bombings, of nights hiding in basements, of a family torn apart before they even reached American soil. Her father's rare, broken stories of those dark days lingered in her mind like old photographs, faded but sharp enough to cut. Now, as an adult, Emily lived in a small, cluttered apartment above a laundromat, the hum of dryers her constant companion. Her walls were covered with sketches of faces she couldn't quite place, soldiers, children, a woman with sorrowful eyes who might have been her grandmother. Each drawing was an attempt to piece together a past she'd only known through fragments, a past that left her with nightmares of explosions she'd never seen, of cries she'd never heard. Yet in her waking hours, she pushed it all down, buried it beneath the daily grind of pouring coffee for regulars at the diner, smiling through gritted teeth and pretending she didn't wake up every morning with a hollow ache in her chest. Her routine was mechanical, predictable, a shield against the memories that clawed at the edges of her mind. Mornings started with black coffee in a chipped mug, the bitter taste grounding her as she stared out her tiny window at the L train rattling past. She'd walk to the diner, her boots crunching on salt-sprinkled sidewalks, nodding to familiar faces. Mr. O'Connell, the Irish butcher who always tipped his hat, or Mrs. Rivera, who sold tamales on the corner during the holidays. But even in these moments of normalcy, there was a fracture. Her smiles never reached her eyes. Her laughter, when it came, was fleeting, as if she feared letting it linger too long. She'd often catch herself tracing the faint scar on her wrist, a mark from a childhood accident, or so she'd been told. But it felt like more, a remnant of something she couldn't name. At night, when the city quieted and the glow of streetlights filtered through her blinds, she'd sit at her small desk, pencil in hand, sketching those haunted faces again and again, as if drawing them might summon answers. Why did her father stop speaking of the past after her mother died? What had they lost beyond the family members buried in a distant land? The questions festered, unanswered, a quiet torment she carried alone. That morning, as she waited for her ride, Emily's mind was elsewhere, tangled in the usual web of worry. The interview at the art gallery downtown was a long shot, a chance to escape the diner and maybe, just maybe, turn her sketches into something more. She needed this, not just for the money, but for a semblance of purpose. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to the present. "Your driver, Walter, is 2 minutes away. Silver Toyota Corolla." She sighed, adjusting her scarf and glanced down the street. The neighborhood was waking up. Dog walkers braving the chill, delivery trucks rumbling along, the faint sound of a Tribune vendor hawking papers on the corner. Just another Chicago morning, tinged with the promise of snow. She didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. Just a quick ride, a few polite words with the driver, and then back to the grind. But sometimes, life has a way of sneaking up on you, of pulling the rug out from under your feet when you least expect it. The silver Corolla pulled up slowly, its tires crunching over the grit of the road. The driver's window was cracked open despite the cold, and a faint whiff of old leather and pipe tobacco drifted out. Emily opened the back door, sliding in with a murmured, "Hey, thanks for the ride," her voice flat, rehearsed. She barely looked at the driver at first, her gaze fixed on her phone as she double-checked the address for the gallery. But then she felt it, a strange, unspoken weight in the air, a silence heavier than the hum of the car's engine. She glanced up, catching the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror. They were old eyes, pale blue and clouded with time, set in a weathered face that seemed carved from stories. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, gripped the steering wheel with a quiet steadiness. His name tag on the dashboard read, Walter J., and a small American flag sticker sat beside it, faded but proud. He nodded at her, his voice gravelly with a hint of a southern drawl. "Mornin', miss. Headin' downtown, right?" Emily nodded, offering a small smile, but something about him tugged at her, a familiarity she couldn't place. Maybe it was the way his eyes held hers for a fraction too long, or the faint tremble in his fingers as he adjusted the mirror. She shook it off, chalking it up to nerves about the interview, and turned her attention to the passing streets. The car rolled past familiar landmarks, the neo-Gothic architecture of Loyola University, the bundled-up joggers along the lakefront path, the murmur of rush hour picking up as they neared the loop. Walter drove in silence for a while, the only sound the faint crackle of an oldies station playing Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire low on the radio. But then, as they stopped at a red light near Michigan Avenue, he cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "You got family from overseas, don't you?" His question came out of nowhere, blunt and unexpected, as if he'd been mulling it over since she got in. Emily froze, her fingers tightening around her phone. She met his gaze in the mirror again, and this time there was something different in his eyes, an intensity, a knowing that sent a shiver down her spine. Yeah, I do," she stammered, caught off guard. Why'd you ask that?" Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment with a slow, deliberate motion, pulling out a small, tattered photograph. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but as he held it up for her to see, Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was a photo of a family, her family. Her father, younger, with that same stern jaw she remembered from childhood, stood beside a woman with sorrowful eyes, the woman from her sketches. And there in the corner, a tiny girl with wide, scared eyes. Her. Emily's heart pounded, a cold sweat prickling her skin. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Walter's eyes softened, but there was pain there, raw and ancient. "I've been carrying this for over 20 years, miss," he said, his voice breaking just enough to crack her world open. "I was there, in Kosovo, during the war. I was a medic with the peacekeeping forces. And I pulled your family out of a burning village one night, saved 'em when no one else could." His words hung in the air, heavy as the November clouds outside, and Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. This man, this stranger, wasn't just her Uber driver. He was a ghost from a past she'd spent her life running from, a past that had just roared back to life in the back seat of a silver Toyota Corolla. Her mind raced, a flood of half-remembered stories crashing over her. The bombings her father spoke of in hushed tones, the nights hiding in basements, the soldiers, American soldiers who came in the chaos. Could this be true? Could Walter be one of them? The faceless savior her father mentioned only once before clamming up forever? She stared at the photograph, her hands trembling now, as tears she hadn't shed in years burned at the edges of her vision. Outside, the city blurred past, skyscrapers and neon signs reflecting off the car windows, but inside, time had stopped. Walter turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her gaze directly for the first time, and said, "There's more to the story, Emily, a lot more, and I think you deserve to know it all." Her name on his lips felt like a thunderclap. How did he know her name? She hadn't said it, hadn't hinted at it. The weight of his words, the photograph, the impossible coincidence, it was too much. Her chest tightened, a mix of dread and desperate hope clawing at her. What did he mean by more? What secrets had he carried all these years? And why, after all this time, had fate, or something else, brought them together on this freezing Chicago morning? Emily's world, already fragile, felt like it was teetering on the edge of something vast and unknowable, and she knew in that moment there was no turning back. Emily sat frozen in the back seat of Walter's silver Toyota Corolla, the faded photograph trembling in her hands. The faces staring back at her, her father's stern jaw, the sorrowful eyes of a woman she'd only known through sketches, and her own tiny, scared face as a child, felt like a punch to the gut. Her chest tightened, each breath shallow and sharp, as if the air in the car had turned to glass. How could this be happening? How could a random Uber ride unearth a piece of her past she'd spent years trying to bury? Her hazel eyes, usually so guarded, brimmed with tears she fought to hold back, blurring the image in her hands. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her throat felt like it was closing, choked by a grief she hadn't touched in years. Confusion clawed at her. Why now? Why him? Why her? Underneath it all, a darker feeling stirred. Fear. Fear of what this man knew, of what he might say next, of truths she wasn't sure she could bear. Walter's voice, gravelly and heavy with unspoken weight, cut through the silence. "I didn't expect to see you today, Emily. Didn't expect I'd ever see any of you again. But I've carried that picture for a long time, just in case." His pale blue eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, and there was a rawness there, a pain that mirrored her own. Emily's fingers tightened around the photo, crumpling the edges. Her mind spun, grasping for something to anchor her. "How do you know my name?" she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "I didn't tell you my name." Walter's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles whitening. "Your father told me back then. Said it over and over like a prayer while I dragged him out of that burn-in village. Emily, my Emily, she's safe. She's gotta be safe." I never forgot it. His words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last, sinking into the pit of her stomach. She remembered her father's silences more than his stories, the way he'd stare out the window of their tiny Chicago apartment, his eyes distant, as if he were still back in Kosovo. She'd always assumed his pain was his alone, something she could never reach. But now, this stranger, Walter, was holding a piece of that pain, a piece of her, and it felt like a violation. Yet beneath the anger, a desperate ache bloomed. She wanted to know more, needed to know more, even if every word threatened to unravel her. I don't understand," she stammered, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her worn wool scarf. "Why didn't you find us sooner? Why keep this picture? Why now?" Her voice rose, edged with a bitterness she hadn't meant to let slip. Walter didn't flinch, but his gaze dropped for a moment, as if her words had struck something tender. "I tried, miss," he said softly. "Back when I got home from the war, I looked for you, but your family moved, changed names maybe. I didn't have much to go on. I figured maybe it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. Didn't think I had the right to dig up old wounds." He paused, his voice dropping even lower. "But I couldn't throw that picture away. It was all I had left of that night, the night I almost didn't make it out myself." Emily's breath hitched. The weight of his words settled over her like the grey November sky outside, oppressive and cold. She wanted to push back, to tell him he had no right to carry her family's pain as some kind of keepsake. But she couldn't, not when his eyes held a grief that felt so achingly familiar. Instead, she looked down at the photograph again, tracing the face of the woman with sorrowful eyes. Her grandmother, she was almost certain now. A woman her father had only mentioned in passing, always with a tightness in his voice, as if saying her name might summon ghosts. Was she with them that night? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter's silence was answer enough, a heavy, pregnant pause that made her heart sink. She didn't make it far after I got him out, he said finally, his voice thick. I'm sorry, Emily. I did everything I could. The words were a blade, slicing through years of carefully built walls. Emily's tears spilled over now, hot and unrelenting, as she clutched the photo to her chest. She'd spent so long trying not to feel this, trying not to let the loss of a family she barely knew consume her. But here it was, raw and real, staring her in the face through the eyes of an old man she'd met only minutes ago. Guilt gnawed at her, sharp and bitter. Guilt for not asking her father more questions while he was alive, for not pressing harder when he shut down. Guilt for letting her own pain blind her to the sacrifices others had made. And beneath it all, a simmering anger at Walter for showing up now, at the world for taking so much, at herself for not being stronger. She felt like a child again, small and scared, lost in a war she'd never seen, but always felt in her bones. Walter pulled the car to a stop at a red light near the iconic Willis Tower, its steel and glass looming over them like a silent witness to their unraveling. The city buzzed outside, honking horns, the chatter of pedestrians bundled against the cold, the distant rumble of the L train, but inside the car, the air was thick with tension. Emily's gaze drifted to the tower, its height a stark reminder of how small she felt in this moment, how easily a single story could dwarf her own. She turned back to Walter, her voice trembling but resolute. What else do you know? What else aren't you telling me? Because I can't just sit here with half the story. I deserve to know everything. Walter's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might shut down, retreat behind the same silence her father had wielded like a shield. But then he sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry decades of burden. There's a lot I ain't said yet, miss. Things your father might not have wanted you to know. Things I ain't sure I got the right to tell. But I reckon you're right. You deserve the truth, even if it hurts. He reached into the glove compartment again, this time pulling out a small, worn envelope, its edges yellowed with age. I kept this too, he said, handing it to her with a hesitant nod. Your father gave it to me that night, asked me to hold on to it if anything happened to him, said it was for you when you were ready. I figured, maybe now's the time. Emily's hands shook as she took the envelope, her fingers brushing against the rough paper. Her name was scrawled across the front in her father's familiar, jagged handwriting, a handwriting she hadn't seen since she was a teenager, since before cancer took him too soon. The sight of it was a gut punch, a direct line to a past she'd tried to outrun. She didn't open it right away, couldn't bring herself to. Instead, she held it like a fragile thing, as if it might crumble under the weight of her touch. "What's in it?" she asked, her voice barely audible, her eyes fixed on the envelope as if it held a bomb instead of answers. Walter's gaze softened, but there was a hardness there too, a resolve that scared her. Letters, I think, maybe more. I never read 'em, weren't mine to read. But your father, he was a man with a lot of ghosts, Emily, and he wanted you to understand 'em when the time came. His words hung between them, heavy with implication. Understand what? The war, the losses, or something darker, something her father had buried so deep even she couldn't reach it. The questions churned in her mind, each one a new layer of dread. She wanted to tear the envelope open right there, to devour whatever truths it held, but fear held her back. What if the words inside broke her in a way she couldn't recover from? The light turned green, and Walter eased the car forward, navigating the crowded streets of downtown Chicago. The tension in the car was palpable now, a living thing that pressed against them both. Emily's thoughts spiraled, memories of her father flashing unbidden, his rare, tight smiles, the way he'd flinch at loud noises like firecrackers on the 4th of July, the way he'd mutter in Albanian under his breath when he thought no one was listening. She'd always known there was more to his story, more to the war that had fractured their family before she was old enough to remember. But she'd never pushed, out of respect, out of fear, out of a childish hope that ignoring the past might make it disappear. Now, though, there was no ignoring it. Walter's presence, the photograph, the envelope, they were a door she couldn't close, even if she wanted to. "You don't have to read it now," Walter said after a long silence, his voice gentler now, almost paternal. "But I gotta warn you, Emily, once you do, there's no going back. Some things, they change how you see everything." "How you see him?" There was a subtext to his words, a warning wrapped in kindness, and it sent a shiver down her spine. What did he mean by that? What could her father have written that might change how she saw him? The man who'd worked 2 jobs to keep her fed, who'd walked her to school every morning until she insisted she was old enough to go alone, who'd died with a quiet resignation she'd never understood. How could anything change the love she felt for him, mixed as it was with unresolved pain? They passed Millennium Park now, the reflective surface of the cloud gate, known to locals as the Bean, glinting. Under the overcast sky, a distorted mirror of the city around them. Emily caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the car window, her face pale and tear-streaked, and felt a surge of disconnection. Who was she, really? Not just the diner waitress with calloused hands and a closet full of sketches, but the daughter of survivors, the heir to a war she'd never fought, but always carried. The weight of that identity pressed down on her, heavier than ever, and she wondered if she'd ever truly known herself at all. Walter's voice broke through her thoughts, softer this time. "You're stronger than you think, miss. I saw it in your father, even in the worst of it. And I see it in you now." His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened her turmoil. Strong. She didn't feel strong. She felt like she was fracturing, like the cracks in her life, already so carefully hidden, were splitting wide open. She thought of her mother, gone when Emily was just 10, a vague memory of warmth and lullabies. Taken by a car accident her father never spoke of without a clenched jaw. She thought of the diner, the regulars who knew her as the girl with the tired smile, not the girl with a war in her blood. And she thought of her sketches, those haunted faces she drew night after night, as if they might speak to her if she got the lines just right. Walter's belief in her strength felt like a lie, but it also sparked something, a tiny, flickering need to prove him right, to prove to herself that she could face whatever was in that envelope. As they neared the art gallery where her interview was supposed to take place, a new layer of tension settled over her. The interview, the job, the chance at a different life, it all seemed trivial now, dwarfed by the enormity of what she held in her hands. She glanced at the envelope again, then at Walter, whose weathered face seemed to carry as many secrets as the paper she clutched. "Why are you telling me all this now?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. "You could have kept driving, kept your mouth shut. Why drag all this up after 20 years? Walter's expression darkened, a shadow passing over his pale blue eyes. "Because I'm old, Emily. Older than I sometimes feel, and I've carried this long enough. Seen too many folks go to their graves with unfinished business. I figured if I ever got the chance, I'd make it right, or at least try to." There was a vulnerability in his voice, a crack in the stoic facade, and it hit Emily harder than she expected. This wasn't just about her family's past, it was about his too. Whatever had happened in Kosovo, it had marked him as deeply as it had marked her father, her grandmother, her own fractured memories. The realization softened her anger, but it didn't erase the fear or the confusion. It only made the tangle of emotions more complex, a knot she couldn't begin to untie. She thought of something then, a fleeting memory from her childhood, her father sitting at their small kitchen table, a glass of cheap whiskey in his hand, staring at a photograph much like the one she held now. She'd asked him about it once, just once, and he'd snapped at her to go to bed, his voice rough with something she later understood as pain. She hadn't asked again. But now, with Walter's confession and this envelope burning a hole in her hands, she wondered if that moment had been a missed chance. A door she could have pried open if she'd been braver. The regret stung, mingling with the grief and fear already swirling inside her. She couldn't change the past, but she could decide what to do with this moment, this unexpected collision of histories. Walter pulled up to the curb outside the gallery, the car idling as the engine hummed softly beneath them. Emily stared out the window at the sleek glass facade of the building, her future waiting just beyond the doors, or what she'd thought was her future. Now, everything felt upended, as if the gallery and the interview were part of someone else's life. She turned back to Walter, her heart pounding so hard she thought he might hear it. "I can't go in there right now," she said, her voice steady for the first time since he'd handed her the photograph. I need to know everything. Not just what's in this envelope, everything you remember, everything you saw. Will you tell me?" Walter's gaze held hers, searching, as if weighing the cost of reopening old wounds. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that felt like a pact. "I'll tell you, miss, but it ain't a short story and it ain't a kind one. We can't sit here on the curb all day. There's a diner a few blocks back near the park. We can talk there if you're sure." His offer hung between them, a lifeline and a challenge all at once. Emily felt the weight of her decision, heavy as the envelope in her hands, heavy as the unspoken stories waiting to be told. She knew that saying yes meant stepping into a past she might not emerge from unscathed. But saying no, turning away from this chance, from Walter, from the truth, felt like a betrayal of her father, of her family, of herself. She glanced at the gallery one last time, the promise of a new start fading against the pull of her past. Then she looked down at the envelope, her father's handwriting a silent plea across time. Her fingers brushed against the paper, and she made her choice. "Let's go to the diner," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "I need to know. All of it." Walter gave a small nod, a flicker of relief, or perhaps resignation, crossing his face as he shifted the car into gear. As they pulled away from the gallery, Emily felt the ground shift beneath her once more, a tectonic movement she couldn't stop, even if she tried. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths Walter would unveil over bitter diner coffee, she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now, and to you, listening to this story unfold, if it's hitting you as hard as it's hitting Emily, don't forget to subscribe for the rest of this journey. We're just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. As Walter pulled away from the gallery, Emily felt the weight of her decision settle into her bones, heavy and unyielding. The city blurred past them, the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets of downtown Chicago fading into a gray haze as they headed toward the diner near Millennium Park. Her hands clutched the worn envelope, her father's jagged handwriting staring up at her like a challenge. She hadn't opened it yet, couldn't bring herself to, not in the confined space of this car with a man who knew more about her past than she did. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat a reminder of the unknown waiting for her, the truths that might shatter the fragile shell she'd built around herself. She stole a glance at Walter, his weathered profile set in a grim determination, as he navigated through traffic. His silence now was deafening, as if he too understood the gravity of what they were driving toward. Not just a diner, not just coffee, but a reckoning. The tension in the car was a living thing, coiling tighter with every block they passed. Emily's mind raced, replaying fragments of her life, her father's distant stares, the sketches of faces she couldn't name, the ache of a history she'd inherited but never fully claimed. What if Walter's story was too much? What if the envelope held something that would break her beyond repair? Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the paper, the rough texture grounding her even as it terrified her. She wanted to ask Walter to stop, to pull over, to give her a moment to breathe, but she knew there was no stopping now. The diner loomed ahead, a nondescript brick building with a flickering neon sign, and as Walter parked the car, Emily felt a wave of nausea. This was it. Whatever he had to say, whatever her father had written, it would change everything. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. They walked into the diner in silence, the bell above the door jingling with a hollow cheer that felt out of place. The smell of grease and burnt toast hit her like a memory of late shifts at her own workplace. A reminder of the life she was supposed to be living, not this detour into a past she'd avoided for so long. Walter gestured to a booth in the corner, far from the handful of early-morning regulars hunched over their coffee. Emily slid into the cracked vinyl seat, the envelope still clutched in her hands, as a waitress with tired eyes poured them each a cup of black coffee without a word. The steam rose in lazy curls, and Emily stared at it, unable to meet Walter's gaze just yet. He cleared his throat, his voice low and steady, but with an undercurrent of something raw, something he'd held back for too long. "I ain't gonna sugarcoat it, Emily. What I gotta tell you, it's heavy, and it's gonna hurt. But I reckon you're owed the whole truth, not just pieces." Her stomach twisted, but she nodded, her jaw tight. "Just tell me. Start from the beginning. That night in the village. What happened?" Walter took a long sip of his coffee, his hands steady despite the tremor she'd noticed earlier. Then he leaned forward, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers, and began to speak. His words painted a picture of chaos, flames licking at the sky, the deafening roar of bombs in the distance, the cries of families torn apart in the darkness. He spoke of being a young medic, barely older than 20, stationed with American peacekeeping forces in Kosovo during the worst of the war. He described the night he found her family, huddled in the ruins of a burning village, her father clutching a tiny Emily to his chest as her grandmother coughed from the smoke, her strength fading with every ragged breath. "I got 'em out of there," Walter said, his voice breaking just enough to reveal the cracks beneath his stoicism. "Dragged your father and you across a field under gunfire, with shells exploding all around us. Your grandmother, she couldn't keep up. I carried her as far as I could, but her lungs gave out. She died there in the mud, whispering your name, Emily. I ain't never forgot that. The way she looked at me, like I had to promise I'd keep you safe." Tears burned in Emily's eyes, spilling over despite her efforts to hold them back. She'd always known her grandmother hadn't made it to America, but hearing it like this, so raw and real, felt like losing her all over again. She wanted to scream, to push the pain away, but Walter kept going, his voice relentless now, as if he needed to get it all out before he lost the nerve. He told her of the days that followed, how he'd gotten her father and her to a refugee camp, how her father had pressed that envelope into his hands with trembling fingers, begging him to keep it safe for Emily, for a future he wasn't sure he'd see. "Your father, he wasn't just fighting for survival that night," Walter said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He was fighting guilt. He'd been part of something back then, something he didn't want you to know. He'd worked with resistance groups, made choices that cost lives, maybe even lives he cared about. He never said it outright, but I saw it in his eyes. He carried that weight, and he didn't want it to fall on you." Emily's breath caught, her mind reeling. Her father, a man of quiet strength and endless sacrifice in her memory, part of a resistance, making choices that cost lives? It didn't fit, couldn't fit, but the look in Walter's eyes told her it was true, or at least that her father had believed it was. The revelation hit like a tidal wave, drowning her in questions she had no answers for. Was this why her father had been so silent about the past? Why he'd shut down whenever she asked about Kosovo? She felt a surge of anger, hot and bitter, at both Walter and her father. Anger for keeping her in the dark, for burdening her with half-truths and shadows. But beneath it, there was a deeper ache, a yearning to understand, to reconcile the man she'd loved with the man Walter described. She looked down at the envelope, her hands shaking now, and knew she couldn't delay any longer. With a deep, shuddering breath, she tore it open, the sound of the paper ripping echoing in her ears like a gunshot. Inside were letters, several of them, written in her father's jagged scrawl, the ink faded, but still legible. The first was dated just weeks after they'd arrived in Chicago, when Emily was still a toddler. Her eyes scanned the words, her heart pounding as she read her father's confession of the choices he'd made during the war, the lives he couldn't save, the blood on his hands he could never wash away. "I did things I'm not proud of, Emily," he wrote, "but I did them to keep us alive, to give you a chance at a life away from that hell. I hope you never have to understand why I made those choices. I hope you can forgive me, even if I can't forgive myself." Each word was a knife, cutting deeper into wounds she hadn't known were there. Tears streamed down her face now, unstopped, as she read of his guilt, his shame, his desperate hope that she'd grow up free of the darkness he carried. Walter watched her in silence, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. When she finished the last letter, her hands dropped to the table, the pages trembling in her grasp. She felt hollowed out, raw, as if the ground beneath her had vanished. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the diner. "I didn't know he felt like this. I thought he was just quiet because of the war, not because of this." Walter nodded, his expression heavy with understanding. "He was a good man, Emily, but good men can do bad things when the world's burning down around them. He wanted to protect you from that. I reckon that's why he never told you." The truth settled over her, heavy and cold, but with it came a strange clarity. All these years, she'd carried her own guilt. Guilt for not asking more, for not pushing harder, for letting her father's silence become her own. She'd run from her past, buried it beneath diner shifts and late-night sketches, but it had always been there, waiting. Now, facing it head-on, she felt the weight shift, not gone, but different. She looked at Walter, really looked at him, and saw not just a stranger, not just a ghost from a war she'd never fought, but a man who'd carried her family's pain as his own for over 2 decades. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry you had to carry this alone. I don't know how to thank you for what you did back then, for saving us." Walter's face softened, a faint, weary smile tugging at his lips. "Ain't no need for thanks, miss. I did what I had to do. But hearing you say that, it eases something in me, something I didn't think could ever ease." There it was, the moment of truth, a quiet forgiveness passing between them, her for his silence, him for her anger. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a start. A crack in the wall that had separated them, that had separated her from her own history. Emily felt a sob rise in her throat, not just for the loss, not just for her father, but for the weight Walter had shouldered alone. She reached across the table, her hand hesitant but resolute, and placed it over his gnarled fingers. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything: gratitude, sorrow, a shared understanding of a pain too big for words. In the days that followed, Emily felt the transformation take root, slow and unsteady but real. She didn't return to the diner for her next shift, instead calling in to say she needed time off. The gallery interview was rescheduled, but even that felt secondary now. She spent hours at her tiny apartment, the envelope and letters spread out on her desk, surrounded by her sketches. She began to draw again, not just the haunted faces, but new ones. Her father, as she remembered him, stern but loving. Walter, with his weathered kindness. And herself, eyes still shadowed, but with a hint of something new, something like resolve. She started writing too, letters of her own, not to send, but to release. Letters to her father, forgiving him, understanding him, loving him despite it all. It was painful, each word a step into uncharted territory, but it was hers to claim. The renunciation came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. She packed away her old sketches, the ones that had haunted her nights, into a box she tucked under her bed. They weren't gone, not erased, but they no longer needed to define her. In their place, she hung a single drawing on her wall, a rough sketch of 3 figures in a burning landscape, a man, a child, and an old woman, with a soldier's shadow behind them, guiding them forward. It was her family, her past, and Walter's sacrifice, captured in pencil and pain. Letting go of the endless cycle of drawing those same faces over and over felt like a sacrifice, a surrender of the unanswered questions she'd clung to. But it also felt like freedom, like making space for something new, even if she didn't know what that was yet. Walter became a quiet presence in her life, not constant, but steady. They met for coffee every few weeks at that same diner, sharing stories, his of the war, hers of her father's later years. He gave her a small medal, one he'd been awarded for his service in Kosovo, and told her to keep it, a symbol of the lives he'd touched, including hers. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, holding the cold metal in her palm, as if it could bridge the years between them. Her routine shifted too. She walked with a different weight now, her smiles at the diner a little more real, her conversations with regulars a little deeper. She wasn't healed, not completely, maybe she never would be, but she was moving, step by shaky step, toward something like peace. One cold evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the streets of Lincoln Park, Emily found herself at a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city, the place where her father had been laid to rest years before. She hadn't visited in a long time, too afraid of the grief it might unearth. But now, with Walter's medal in her pocket and her father's letters folded close to her heart, she knelt before the simple headstone, brushing away the frost with gloved hands. She placed the medal gently on the ground, a quiet offering, a tether between the past and the present. The snow fell in silent flakes, blanketing the world in a hush, as if time itself had paused to witness this moment of release. She whispered words she'd never said aloud before, forgiveness, love, goodbye, and felt the weight lift, just a little, just enough. As she stood, her breath visible in the frigid air, a thought settled over her, heavy with truth. Time doesn't erase the scars of war, but it can teach us how to live with them. It can show us that healing isn't about forgetting, but about carrying the pain with purpose, about finding connection in the ashes of what was lost. War breaks us in ways we can't predict, but so does love, so does forgiveness, and maybe that's the only way we rebuild, by letting the broken pieces fit together in new shapes, imperfect but whole. And to you, listening to Emily's story, if it's stirred something in your heart, if it's made you think of your own past, your own losses, or your own need for healing, I want to hear from you. Comment below with "I believe in second chances" if this resonated with you. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even the heaviest burdens can be carried together. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this, stories of pain and hope and everything in between, don't forget to subscribe. We've got more to tell, and I'd love for you to be part of it.